My grandfather's farm was the only one in our valley that never failed. Not once. Not during the drought that emptied 3 villages. Not during the year the locusts came. Not during the winter so cold the river itself stopped moving. Every neighbor lost something. My grandfather never did. For years I thought it was luck. It wasn't luck. It was 7 rules. Rules he followed without exception. Rules he never wrote down. Rules he expected me to learn only by watching. I broke one of them, once, when I was 17 and certain I knew better than an old man. I want to tell you what happened. But first, you should know something about Rule 4. It sounds like superstition. It isn't. Researchers studying Anatolian soil and crop cycles have recently confirmed the exact reasoning behind it, without ever knowing an old farmer already understood it 100 years ago. 7 rules, 1 broken promise, and 1 old man who was right about everything.
Before we go further, if stories like this, real Anatolian farming life, the old ways, the hard-earned wisdom, mean something to you, subscribe now. This channel exists to keep these stories alive. Rule number 1. Never break ground before the soil tells you it is ready. Every spring, the younger farmers in our village grew restless before my grandfather did. They watched the calendar. He watched the earth. I remember standing beside him in late March, the air already warm, other men already out with their oxen, and my grandfather crouched down, pushed 2 fingers into the soil, and simply shook his head. "Not yet," he said. 3 more days. I asked him how he knew. He told me to smell it. I thought he was mocking me. He wasn't. Soil that is ready to be turned has a particular scent, a kind of sweetness that comes only after it is warmed through, not just on the surface, but several inches down. Turn it too early, while the deeper layers are still cold and locked, and you wake the topsoil while the roots below stay dormant. The seed goes in confused. It sits in warm soil above and cold soil below, and it either rots or grows weak. This was not written in any book my grandfather owned, because he owned none. It came from his father, who got it from his father before him. A chain of men standing in the same fields, learning the same lesson the hard way, generation after generation, until the timing became instinct rather than knowledge. The 3 farmers who ignored him that spring and planted early lost nearly 1/3 of their seed to rot. My grandfather's field, planted 3 days later, came up even and strong. He never explained it as science. He didn't need to. He only needed to be right, every year, without exception. I asked him once why he didn't just wait longer, if waiting was so important. Why not a full week instead of 3 days? He laughed at that, the way he laughed at most questions that assumed farming was simple. Wait too long, he said, and you lose the moisture the winter left behind. The rule was, never wait as long as possible. It was wait exactly long enough. And knowing the difference took him decades to learn from his own father, who had learned it the same slow way. There was no shortcut offered to me either. He would not simply hand me the timing. He made me kneel in the dirt beside him every spring, press my own fingers into the soil, and guess. Most years I guessed wrong. He let me guess wrong. He said a farmer who is told the answer forgets it by next spring, but a farmer who feels the difference with his own hands never does. Years later, long after he was gone, I read something in passing about soil temperature and seed germination, about how a seed's internal clock depends on consistent warmth through its full depth, not just a warm surface, and how uneven temperature between topsoil and subsoil can delay or damage early root development entirely. It was written in careful, technical language, footnoted and precise, and it took the writer several paragraphs to explain what my grandfather had communicated to me with 2 fingers and a single word. Not yet. I sat with that for a long time. Not because the science surprised me, because it didn't.
It simply confirmed, decades late, something an uneducated farmer in a small Anatolian valley had already known his entire working life. Rule number 2. Feed the ground before you feed yourself.
This was the rule that confused me most as a boy, because it seemed backward. We were often hungry in the lean years, and yet every autumn, before winter wheat went in, my grandfather insisted on returning something to the soil first. Composted manure, ash from the hearth, the stalks and husks left over from the last harvest, worked back into the earth instead of burned. Other families, especially in the hungriest years, skipped this. They needed every scrap for themselves, for their animals, for anything that might stretch a meal further. My grandfather never skipped it, not once, even the year we had almost nothing. He used to say the field was a mouth too, and if you stopped feeding it, it would stop feeding you. I watched families who ignored this rule for 2 or 3 seasons in a row lose yield every single year, their soil growing thinner and more stubborn, producing less no matter how hard they worked it. My grandfather's field, fed every year without fail, kept its strength decade after decade. What he was doing, without ever using the word for it, was maintaining the soil structure and its living population, the microorganisms and organic matter that hold moisture, hold nutrients, and hold the whole system together. Strip that away, and no amount of effort in spring can fully make up for it. He wasn't sentimental about the land. He was simply unwilling to take from something without giving something back. There was a particular winter, one of the hardest I remember, when my grandmother argued with him about this rule for the first and only time I ever witnessed. We had almost nothing left in the storehouse. She wanted to burn the collected husks for warmth instead of working them into the frozen ground in spring. He refused, quietly, the way he refused most things, without raising his voice. He told her the cold would pass in a season, a weak field would not. She was angry with him for weeks. But that spring, our field came up the same as always, while 2 families who had burned everything for warmth watched their yields drop noticeably below what they needed. I think about that argument often now, because it was the only time I saw him choose the land over his own family's comfort, and the only time in my life I saw that choice proven right within a single year. My grandmother never brought it up again either, but I noticed something after that winter. She began saving scraps herself, without being told, setting aside anything that could go back into the ground before anything went into the fire. It became a habit in our house that outlasted the argument that started it, one of those small domestic shifts nobody announces out loud. Feed the ground before you feed yourself was never really about the field alone. It was about a kind of patience most people, myself included at that age, find almost impossible to practice when the immediate need feels louder than the distant one. Rule number 3. Trust the animals before you trust the sky. My grandfather rarely looked up to judge the weather. He looked at the geese. He looked at the ants. He watched how low the swallows flew in the evening and how tightly the sheep huddled before dusk. I remember one August afternoon, clear and hot, not a cloud within reach of the horizon, when he suddenly ordered every hand in the field to bring in the drying grain, immediately. No explanation given beyond one sentence. The ants are moving their eggs uphill. 3 hours later, a storm broke over the valley that flooded 2 neighboring fields and destroyed grain that had been left out to finish drying. Ours was already under cover. He was not reading omens. He was reading pressure, the kind of subtle shift in the air that animals sense long before humans do, changes so small our senses barely register them, but theirs do, tied to instincts built over far longer than any human farming tradition. My grandfather never claimed to understand why the animals knew. He simply understood that they did, and that ignoring them had cost families more grain over the years than any single mistake he ever made himself. It wasn't only ants and storms. He watched the sheep at dusk, the way they clustered tight against the far wall of the pen instead of spreading out to graze the last light. He watched which direction the swallows dove when they hunted low over the field,
and how many days in a row the well water tasted faintly different before a shift in weather arrived. None of it was mystical to him. He simply treated the animals and the land as instruments more sensitive than his own senses, tools that had been calibrated by instinct over far longer than his own lifetime, and he trusted the reading over his own eyes pointed at a clear sky. The neighbors who mocked this habit, who called it an old man's superstition behind his back, were often the same neighbors standing in a ruined field a few hours later, wondering how he always seemed to know.
He tried once to teach a group of younger farmers what to look for, gathering a handful of them one evening near the sheep pen and pointing out the details he noticed almost without thinking. Most of them nodded politely and forgot it by the following week. Only one boy, the son of a widow with almost no land of her own, kept coming back, asking questions, standing beside my grandfather at dusk the same way I did. That boy grew into one of the few farmers in the next generation who never lost a harvest to sudden weather, and he credited it, until the day he himself grew old, to a handful of evenings spent watching sheep with a man who was not even his own grandfather. Rule number 4. Never let one crop stand alone in a field for long. This is the rule I promise to return to, because it is the one modern science has only recently caught up to, though my grandfather could not have named a single mechanism behind it. In our valley, most farmers planted wheat, and only wheat, year after year, in the same soil, exhausting it steadily until yields declined and nothing but rest could restore it. My grandfather did something different. He planted lentils and other legumes in rotation alongside his wheat, sometimes in neighboring strips, sometimes in the same field across seasons, and he treated this practice as absolutely non-negotiable, the same way he treated feeding the soil in Rule 2. As a boy, I assumed this was simply about variety, about not wanting to eat wheat bread every single day of the year. It wasn't. It was about the soil itself. Legumes host bacteria in their roots capable of pulling nitrogen directly from the air and depositing it into the soil. Nitrogen that the following wheat crop then draws on to grow strong without the field ever being artificially fed. This is now a well-documented, well-studied agricultural mechanism, confirmed repeatedly by modern soil science, and it explains something that used to look like coincidence. Why my grandfather's wheat fields, planted in rotation with legumes, consistently outperformed his neighbors' fields that grew wheat alone, season after season, without any additional feeding beyond what Rule 2 already provided. He had no laboratory. He had no chemistry. He had only several generations of careful observation, passed down as an unbending rule, that happened to align precisely with a biological process no one in our valley had a name for. Science did not discover something new here. It simply arrived, centuries later, at a conclusion my grandfather's family already lived by. I remember an agricultural officer visiting our region once, sent from a government program encouraging farmers to expand wheat production for a single cash crop. He walked our fields, then walked the neighbors' fields, and stopped, genuinely puzzled, in front of my grandfather's strips of alternating wheat and lentils. He asked why we wasted good wheat land on legumes instead of maximizing a single crop the way the program recommended. My grandfather answered him the same way he answered most outsiders, briefly and without much patience. He said the wheat grows better this way, and pointed at the stalks as proof. The officer wrote something in a notebook and moved on, unconvinced, urging the rest of the village towards single-crop planting instead. Within a few years, the fields that followed the officer's advice had visibly thinned, their yields sliding lower each season, while my grandfather's rotated strips kept producing at the same steady strength they always had. Nobody in the government program ever came back to ask him why. Decades later, when I finally read about nitrogen fixation properly, about root nodules and rhizobia bacteria and the precise biological exchange happening invisibly beneath every strip of legumes he ever planted, I found myself almost laughing out loud at how simple it actually was, and how thoroughly it explained a pattern I had grown up inside of without ever questioning it. The wheat wasn't lucky, it wasn't blessed,
It was being fed, quietly, by its neighbor in the next strip over, in a partnership my grandfather had inherited as an unexplained rule and treated with the same seriousness other men reserved for religious observance. He was not guessing. Neither was his father, or his father's father. Somewhere far back in that chain, someone had noticed the pattern once, tested it, trusted it, and passed it forward, long before anyone had a word for nitrogen at all. Rule number 5. No harvest belongs to one man alone. When the wheat was ready, my grandfather never brought it in with just our own hands. He called on the neighbors, and they called on him in turn, an unspoken agreement stretching back generations, where an entire section of the village would gather to bring in one family's harvest in a single push, then move to the next family's field the following day. Some of the younger, more independent farmers in our valley resisted this practice. They wanted to keep to themselves, to owe no one anything, to bring in their own harvest at their own pace. My grandfather thought this was not just impractical, but dangerous. A harvest brought in slowly, over many days by a single family, sits exposed to weather, to pests, to spoilage, for far longer than a harvest brought in within 2 or 3 days by 20 pairs of hands working together. He lost almost nothing to late-season rain because his grain was always in before the rain arrived. Families who insisted on working alone regularly lost a portion of their crop simply to time, to the sheer number of days their grain sat vulnerable in the field. My grandfather's rule wasn't really about kindness, though it looked like kindness. It was about speed. And speed, in farming, is very often survival.
There was an order to it, too, one he never had to explain because everyone in the village already understood it without being told. The families with the smallest, most exposed plots were brought in first, before the larger, better sheltered fields, because a small field lost to weather hurt a struggling family far more than a large field lost would hurt a family already comfortable. This wasn't written anywhere. It was simply agreed upon, season after season, an unspoken hierarchy of need that the whole village honored without resentment. My grandfather was often among the first to offer his hands to the poorest households, before anyone had even asked him, and it was understood without words that when his own harvest came, every one of those same households would appear in his field at first light, scythes already in hand. I never once saw a ledger kept for any of this, no tally of who owed whom a day's labor. It simply balanced itself, year after year, through memory and reputation alone. A family known to disappear when others needed help quickly found itself standing alone when its own harvest came due. And word of that kind of absence traveled through a small valley faster than almost anything else. My grandfather understood this without ever stating it plainly. Generosity in a farming village was not charity. It was insurance, paid forward in sweat instead of coin. And he never once treated it as optional. Rule number 6. Never let the water source go unwatched. Every household in our village depended on the same stream, the same wells, the same seasonal channels that carried meltwater down from the hills each spring. My grandfather treated the health of that water source as seriously as he treated his own field, walking the length of the stream regularly, clearing debris, reinforcing eroded banks, watching for anything that might choke or divert the flow before it became a crisis. Other farmers considered this someone else's responsibility, or no one's responsibility at all, until the year a blockage upstream, left unattended for weeks, cut water to nearly half the village during the driest stretch of summer. My grandfather's section of the channel, maintained continuously, kept flowing. He often said that a farmer who watches only his own field and ignores the water feeding it is a farmer standing on borrowed time. This wasn't wisdom unique to him. It reflected something Anatolian farming communities understood for centuries, that shared water systems only function when treated as a shared responsibility, not an afterthought. He kept a simple wooden tool, worn smooth from decades of use, specifically for clearing the channel of silt and fallen branches, and he carried it with him almost as often as he carried his own farming tools.
I used to complain as a boy about walking the stream with him instead of playing with the other children after our own chores were finished. He never forced me to come. He simply reminded me every time that the stream did not belong to us any more than it belonged to anyone else, and that a farmer who only tends what is legally his and nothing more is a farmer who has misunderstood what actually keeps a village alive. It took me a long time to understand that this rule was, in its own quiet way, the same lesson as Rule 5. Nothing on that land truly survived in isolation. Not the harvest, not the water, not the family working it. Rule number 7. Never touch the seed grain, no matter how hungry you are. This is the rule I broke.
Every year, before anything else was eaten, sold, or traded, my grandfather set aside a portion of the harvest and sealed it, untouched, as seed grain for the following spring. It did not matter how difficult the winter became. It did not matter how tempting it was during a hungry stretch in February to open that sack instead of going without. That grain existed for one purpose only, and touching it for any other reason was, in my grandfather's mind, the single greatest failure a farmer could commit against his own future. I understood this rule my whole childhood. I respected it. And then, the year I turned 17, convinced I understood farming better than an old man who had never read a book in his life, I made a decision on my own, without asking him. A neighboring trader offered a price for grain that seemed too good to refuse, enough to buy tools I was certain would modernize our small plot and make the coming years easier. I sold part of the seed grain without telling my grandfather, confident I would simply buy replacement seed before spring. I could not. The price of seed grain that particular year, after a difficult regional harvest, tripled by planting season, and what I had sold for a quick gain could not be replaced without selling something far more valuable. I remember the exact moment he discovered it. He opened the storeroom before dawn, the way he did every morning, and stood in the doorway for a long time without saying anything at all. I stood behind him, already knowing what he was looking at, already rehearsing an explanation I never got the chance to give, because he simply turned, looked at me once, and walked out toward the field without a single word. That silence lasted 3 days. Not anger exactly, something quieter and harder to sit inside of. On the 4th day, he handed me a hoe at first light and said only, "We work today," as if nothing needed to be said beyond that. He never once raised the mistake again after that spring, not in anger, not even as a lesson. He simply worked twice as hard alongside me, planting a smaller field than we should have needed, watching it more carefully than I had ever seen him watch anything before, as though he no longer trusted the season to be forgiving twice in 1 year. We survived that year, but it was thin, and it was hard, and every difficult week of it was a direct result of one decision I made because I believed, at 17, that I already knew everything an old man had spent 60 years learning. I understand Rule 4 differently now than I did as a boy. I understand all 7 rules differently now. At the time, they felt like superstition, stubbornness, an old man's refusal to change with the times. It took me years and one very expensive mistake to understand that every single one of those rules had been tested, not in a laboratory, but across generations of real winters, real droughts, and real hungry years, until only the rules that actually worked survived to be passed down at all. My grandfather never called it science. He called it simply the way things are done. But the soil didn't care what he called it. It only responded to whether he was right, and for 60 years, in every season I ever witnessed, he was. He is gone now. And the valley itself has changed more in the years since than it did in the 60 years before that. Fewer families farm the old plots at all. Fewer children kneel beside a grandfather to learn the smell of ready soil, or walk a stream with him instead of playing, or stand in a doorway at dawn learning a harder lesson than they expected. I still keep his seed grain rule, every single year without exception,
because it is the one debt I still feel I owe him. And every spring, before I break ground, I still kneel down the way he taught me, press 2 fingers into the earth, and wait until it tells me it is ready, not a day sooner.
If this story meant something to you, if you want to see the old Anatolian ways preserved instead of forgotten, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Like this video if you believe stories like my grandfather's deserve to be remembered. And tell us in the comments which of these 7 rules surprised you the most. This channel is building a real community around these stories. People who care about where this knowledge came from and who don't want to see it disappear. If that's you, you belong here. Welcome to the Anatolian peasant farmers family.